Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for coming. This is the Ecofeminist Craftivism workshop, which is part of our Green Film Festival here at UEA. So yeah, thank you so much for coming. I'm Miriam Kent. I am a film and media lecturer at, weirdly now, the University of Leeds. I was here for a very, very long time prior to that, but I've come down from sunny Leeds to do this workshop, especially for the festival. So yeah, I'm going to do maybe about half an hour of talking at you about ecofeminism and craftivism and what it is, just to kind of gauge. Do any of you know what ecofeminism is? Kind of, yeah. Do any of you know what craftivism is? Okay, good. So it's good that I pitched it to non-experts. So hopefully this will work. Okay. So yeah, as I said, I'm gonna kind of talk at you for a little while. But what I really wanted this to be is just a kind of communal space where you can do some crafts that express how you feel about environmental stuff, which is obviously the theme of our festival. So just to clarify, ecofeminism, I'm going to go into a bit more detail, but very, very basically, ecofeminism is a mashup of words, ecological plus feminism. So ecology, kind of concerned with the relationship very broadly, obviously. I'm not a scientist or ecological expert, but it's a very broad definition. It's about the relationship of living things to their environment and each other. Plus feminism is a series of political movements that campaign for equality between people of different genders, including factors such as race, sexuality, class, ability, age, all of those different kind of aspects of who we are and how we experience the world kind of coming together. Again, this is a very kind of simplistic definition. Craftivism, in a similar way, is a mashup of the words craft and activism. So it's a form of activism, so being active in terms of politics, in terms of enacting change on the world, that uses craft, or what's in academic context referred to as domestic arts, to promote activist messages. This obviously has a quite long tradition before it was called craftivism, as in women doing stuff, making things that are kind of promoting political messages. But the word craftivism itself was coined by the writer Betsy Greer in 2003. And this is an image from her book, which kind of represents an example of craftivism. It's a little knitted mouse with a sign down with fat cats. It's obviously kind of being a kind of campaign against, well, rich people being horrible to poor people. So Betsy Greer's definition of craftivism is kind of activism that involves crafts, which is kind of motivated by the idea that, and I quote, "the creation of things by hand reminds us that we have power." Okay, so it's actually engaging with this idea that we can make things, we can create things, and in the same way that we can create things, we can create change in the world to make it a better place. Craftivism is often kind of connected to feminist politics that value art forms that are often devalued within patriarchal, as kind of male-dominated societies, because they're associated with femininity. So things like needlework and knitting. I remember when Tom Daley kind of he had to like come out as an avid, knitter and crocheter, right? And he makes these amazing jumpers and things. But it was a big deal, right? Because it's associated with femininity. He's obviously like a gay man as well, which adds another kind of layer of kind of power and power dynamics there. It's often ugly on purpose, so to speak. So the point is not like being good at the craft and making everything look really pretty. So this idea of it being ugly on purpose, it's just about kind of going with it and kind of embracing how, you know, your expression is, regardless of how, you know, wider, you know, opinions think of it. You know, it's not very pretty. Who cares, right? Just some examples. This is an example. I'm not sure if you can see it, but yarn bombing. I don't know if you've come across yarn bombing. If you've ever seen like a post box that's kind of covered in like knitted fabric, right? That's yarn bombing. It's a form of kind of craftivism and political kind of activism. It's like graffiti, but it doesn't actually damage the property because it's like it's knitted around the object, right? This is just an example from a Black Lives Matter exhibition quite recently in Los Angeles. Marianne Jorgensen has covered this as an art installation in which a tank, which is obviously an object of war and violence and domination, covered in very nice, and it is pink. You can't really see it because we don't have blinds in these lovely rooms. It's covered in pink, kind of knitted fabrics, and it's to kind of soften that edge of kind of militaristic oppression, to make a statement against, you know, military action that is very harmful. So hopefully that kind of clarifies what craftivism is. It's essentially just making stuff in a way that expresses political sentiments and kind of drives awareness of various issues. Ecofeminism is a bit more complex because we can kind of think of it as a political movement. So it's got roots in second wave, that is kind of 1970s, feminist activism that was basically critiquing women's traditional roles, for example, as housewives and caregivers, and championing the idea that women should be able to take control of their bodies. For instance, the pill was one of the main kind of things on which the kind of feminist movement hinged, the idea that women can choose to have children. Obviously a big thing going on in the States at the moment where those rights are being revoked. There's also a crossover between ecofeminism and kind of 1960s broader kind of pro-peace, anti-military protest movements. All of these things kind of intersect with ecofeminism. It's essentially kind of ecological awareness that came about at the same time as activists critiquing male-dominated societies and inequality resulting from industrial developments. I will give you some examples of this, because this is all very, you know, kind of theoretical and maybe a little bit different to kind of seeing things in action. Ecofeminism, at the heart of ecofeminism, is discussions about the relationship between gender and nature. And we might kind of take these for granted a little bit. We might think of Mother Nature, for instance. Why is nature a mother? Well, that goes back a long time. It's been thought of as feminine, nature that is. It's been thought of as like a feminine thing since, you know, at least the ancient Greeks, who kind of thought of nature as this living, nurturing being that gave life, just as kind of women were thought to, you know, give life as well. To ancient Greeks, the earth and nature was precious, right, and it needed protecting. On the other hand, this is kind of the other side of the same coin. In the 18th century, industrialization kind of led to the idea that nature is a resource that humans have to use, right? They have to make use of it. Natural resources were seen as, and I quote, inert matter, so just like dead stuff, right? Which meant that, you know, people can just use it and abuse it however they want and exploit it, essentially. This was all kind of done in the name of progress, right? So we need to extract loads of oil out of the earth so that we can power all our machines and be like technologically advanced, right? The idea is in ecofeminism that the exploitation of the earth parallels women's lack of rights, choice, and power at various times in history, right? But, you know, while having slightly different effects, these two perspectives. So the ancient Greek perspective of like, we need to protect the earth because it's precious and it gives life, versus the kind of industrialized approach that's more around like, we need to use the earth and, you know, do it so that we can progress as a civilization. They have different effects in terms of how people relate to nature, but both perspectives still assume that women and nature are somehow linked, which is, if you think about it, if you deconstruct it a little bit, it's kind of random. Like, why does that have to be the case, right? And that is kind of the idea that's criticized by a lot of ecofeminists. Does that all make sense? Does anyone have any questions? Or? Okay, hopefully it will make sense. I just thought I'd give you some examples of kind of key people. I really struggled to find an image of Françoise d'Orbonne, who actually coined the term ecofeminism. I struggled to find an image of her not smoking, which is like, and this kind of points to the idea that obviously like cigarette butts are a massive kind of pollutant in the world, but it points to the idea that, you know, we don't like unquestioningly kind of worship these figures. And I'm not saying, you know, this is the be all and end all of ecofeminism. This is just to kind of provide an overview and some food for thought so that you can kind of go off and read up about stuff yourself. But Françoise d'Orbonne suggested that there are similarities in how kind of male-dominated societies treat women and the environment, which resulted in destruction, pollution, and inequalities, and she encouraged women to join environmental activism, essentially. Another key person, American philosopher, Caroline Merchant. She was interested in pesticides, actually, and pollutants. And what she kind of lamented was the earth sickness, and this is a quote, caused by radioactive wastes, pesticides, plastics, photochemical smog, and fluorocarbons. This was written in 1980, and we're still dealing with, you know, the fallout of this stuff. So kind of shows you how society has progressed. Caroline Merchant importantly kind of drew attention to how nature's exploitation kind of relied on the idea that nature is female, which also in turn kind of encouraged the mistreatment of women. So it's like a circular kind of thing going on. This is a little scary, but it's just an example of a kind of a march that was held. This is the Women's Pentagon Action March, which was kind of held in the US. This is part of like a string of events and conferences and protests in various parts of the world, mostly in the US and Britain, just drawing attention to ecofeminism and the relationship between women and kind of environmental change. There was one in California in 1987 that was quite importantly attended by Angela Davis, who's like a feminist, anti-racist writer and philosopher who drew attention to the intersections of kind of racial oppression with these problems as well. Just kind of thinking about international perspectives, Vandana Shiva. She's actually a physicist, she's Indian, and she kind of highlights the idea of colonialism being a problem when it comes to kind of the exploitation of the earth, and also the way in which all of this is gendered. If you think about kind of early colonialists going from Britain to America to Virginia, right? They thought of it as virgin land, untouched land. It wasn't untouched land. It was occupied by Native Americans who were soon eradicated, right? So the reason why ecofeminism might not be as well known as maybe other forms of feminism is because it kind of fell out of favor with feminist movements in the 1990s that were kind of explicitly criticizing 1970s feminisms for kind of focusing mainly on issues that affected kind of white, affluent, kind of heterosexual women. There have been a lot of criticisms of ecofeminist perspectives that specifically kind of lean into that idea that women are essentially closer to nature. There's something called like goddess feminism that's just about like worshipping the kind of the feminine aspect of nature and kind of suggesting that that is, you know, the case, right? Women are closer to nature, then not necessarily. There are more complex approaches, and the point is that there is no kind of unifying approach, and it's about kind of you thinking about your own values and politics and how that links to kind of broader issues. Most ecofeminists didn't actually mean to suggest that women are essentially closer to nature or have a special relationship with nature, but they were critiquing how society kind of forced this relationship, which resulted in both bad things happening to women and also the environment, right? The ultimate aim was to have a world without these hierarchies based on domination and exploitation, including of humans and non-humans, right? And I'll give you some examples as well. So in the 1970s, women staged a protest against the deforestation of 10,000 square miles of Himalayan forest, forcing the loggers to retreat. Interestingly, the men of the village were kind of coaxed away from the village when the loggers came in. They were kind of basically bribed to stay away. So the women, they were left on their own, and they had to kind of take action to avoid this deforestation. This is called the Chipko Movement. It's Hindi for to cling, and they wrapped their arms around the trees that were marked for chopping and just refused to move. This is generally seen as the origin of the phrase tree hugging. So if anybody ever calls you a tree hugger, that's not a bad thing, because these women are badass. This is Gaura Devi, who was a key figure who kind of led these protests in 1974. She died at a very young age of 66, unfortunately. Kenya, 1977. This is the Green Belt movement, which is a grassroots movement that promotes landscape restoration and reforestation. They protect the local environment and kind of laid the foundations for developmental equality. So in other words, it's women kind of taking action, having their say, and kind of taking action against injustices, right? It was founded by Wangari Maathai, who was the first African woman and first environmentalist to win the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004. She was the first East African woman to also earn a doctorate degree, which is pretty cool. Just another brief example from New York, 1978, the Love Canal disaster. This was a neighborhood in Niagara Falls where there was a canal that was then used as a chemical dumping site by chemical companies, which started to then leak toxic waste and caused chronic illnesses, congenital disorders, birth disorders, and miscarriages. Eventually, Love Canal was evacuated and people lost their homes and were displaced essentially. Lois Gibbs was a former homemaker, so a housewife, and she became an activist that kind of led this movement. And a bit closer to home, Soil Sisters. It's part of the Women's Environmental Network. It's mostly based in women's refuges, predominantly in East London, and according to the website, brings social and therapeutic gardening to support women living in refuges who have experienced domestic violences. This is part of a wider movement called therapeutic horticulture. I'm not sure if you've come across this, also known as green care. The idea is that the women in the refuge kind of transform this garden into something that is abundant and has lots of growth, and it ties into kind of that idea that they are kind of transforming their lives and also taking action. But there's also a lot of kind of literature about the well-being benefits of being in touch with nature and gardening. This goes back much further, though. This is an art installation from Helen Alon. She's an American artist. It's called The Earth Ambulance. It was during a time when America set up a bunch of kind of nuclear weapons bases, and she was protesting this. And what they did was they had this ambulance, and they traveled around North America, and they got a load of soil from these different places in America where there were these centers. And they put the soil in, it sounds really random, they put the soil in pillowcases, right? because they were campaigning against the Strategic Air Command, which was a sack. So they put the soil in the pillowcases, which is another type of sack, and they wrote all of their kind of wishes for the future on these pillowcases, traveled them across the country to the UN headquarters, and kind of installed them as this art installation, this quite intricate art installation that was supposed to draw attention to these issues that were caused by kind of nuclear warfare and the Cold War at the time. Just a final example, Blued Trees Symphony by Aviva Ramani, which was a performance art piece that looked at whether copyright law could be used to protect nature. And what she did was she marked these trees that were placed along this area that was marked for development of an oil and gas pipeline, which was a big issue that was facing particularly a lot of kind of Native American communities and disrupting their land. She marked them with non-toxic paint, and the waves marked on the trees represented musical notes. And it feels a bit weird to imagine it, so I've kind of put this image here. They're all in a row, and each tree represents a note, and effectively these trees, if looked at in this order, can form this symphony, right? And they can be played by live musicians, or you can upload the GPS coordinates to some free software, some free music notation software, and have it played to you, right? Which is just a very lovely kind of idea. Right, I'm going to kind of draw this to a close, but I thought I would outline some eco-feminist issues that maybe inspire you a little bit. Women work in global agriculture in large numbers, but cultural barriers prevent them from owning land and getting loans and buying insurance, which then affects how the land is used, right? This is what's referred to as the agricultural gender gap. According to studies, reducing this gender gap would have a really positive effect against climate change. And all of this kind of links to improving literacy and education, which also kind of has a positive impact on communities in which women are responsible for agricultural management. Women apparently make up more than 2/3 of the world's 796 million illiterate people. So at the heart of a lot of these campaigns is increasing education. It also increases the likelihood of kind of consensual family planning, which will improve climate change related to population growth specifically. Women are also underrepresented in climate policy making, but women are 14 times more likely to die from climate-related disaster than men and suffer disproportionately from resource depletion. This is caused by traditional gender roles. Again, thinking even on a basic level, like being able to swim, right? Learning how to swim, that's part of kind of education, right? If you need to like escape a flood, being able to swim is a good thing. If you can't swim, that's a problem, right? Interestingly, climate change also makes gender roles more extreme and corresponds with more gender-based violence. On the other hand, studies have shown that women tend to care more about social issues and natural resources and are more aware of their impact on the environment. A lot of that maybe has to do with the way in which women are kind of organizing homes and households and buying things and buying food for their families, right? The new generation of environmentalists is mostly female, right? Most of these activists are young, well-educated women, which again points to the idea that if you increase women's education and literacy, tangible action can happen against climate change, right? But we need to remember that climate change impacts those who are already at a disadvantage. They are more likely to live in climate-affected areas, lack access to resources, and are less able to relocate. Back, was it last year when there were the floods in Germany, there were examples of care homes where the residents of the care homes were just unable to escape because they had disabilities, because they were old, because they couldn't swim, right? They couldn't get in a rubber dinghy. If you're in a wheelchair, you can't get in a rubber dinghy, right? So increasing kind of access to resources is really crucial. Yeah, I also have this example from Hurricane Katrina. Obviously, Black communities were suffering the most from Hurricane Katrina, but LGBTQ members were then in turn discriminated against by emergency services, a lot of which were kind of faith-based emergency services. So it's like this kind of different levels of how you experience the world and how you experience power dynamics, right? So you're already, your house is flooded, you have no home, you're black in a white-dominated society, and then you're being discriminated against because you're LGBTQ. It's a lot to deal with. So yeah, essentially education leads to climate awareness, leads to action, which is kind of my kind of summary for all of this. Enhancing women's access to resources improves climate action in a measurable way, right? And I thought I'd just kind of end on this COVID note, because that's what we're all dealing with, right? During the pandemic, grassroots social and environmental action was limited because of the lockdowns and the move to virtual meeting platforms. And this made it a lot easier for governments to kind of ignore important issues affecting vulnerable populations, right? A lot of feminist activists were very frustrated with the speed at which governments were responding to COVID, which demonstrated that, well, we can take action. We can do tangible things that change the world in a very short amount of time, right? And this ethos can be applied to other issues as well. People suffering from the pandemic were also dealing with other disasters at the same time. So again, hurricanes, floods all over the world going on at the same time as COVID, right? Intersecting issues. So in examining the relationships between humans, nature, animals, and inequality, an ecofeminist response can help rebuild communities responsibly. So I kind of put together some bullet points here, what, in my opinion, ecofeminism can do. And I would suggest that it can describe how climate change is not a neutral occurrence. We're all affected by climate change in a different way. It can consider how gender, race, sexuality, class, and ability intersect in relation to people's ability to cope with climate change. It can bring attention to the need to provide resources for those who will be most affected by climate change. It can fight against hierarchies that value one group of people or species over another. So it also questions these oppositions that we take for granted, male versus female, nature versus humans, animals versus humans, right? We can get rid of those gradually. And in doing that, we can get rid of social inequalities. Ecofeminism can actively support people all over the world to positively impact the environment. And ecofeminism can have an ethic of community care and responsibility to each other, to animals, and to nature. So it's your turn now. I've done enough talking at you. What I would like you to do is, through this kind of ethic of craftivism, I would like you to make something inspired by ecofeminism. I've put a few suggested themes. If you want to just do your own thing, that's also fine. If you want to create like an abstract response, like a draw how you feel kind of situation, that's also fine. But I've put some sample themes here. Ecofeminism is, and then what it is to you, your hopes for the future, how some of the issues today might be portrayed, for instance, in an image, or you could look up some quotes from ecofeminist activists. If you scan this code here, you'll get a copy of the slides on your devices if you want to kind of recap anything. There is equipment and, well, craft supplies on the tables over there and at the back of the room. I've already filled up some glue. You can use brushes to spread glue if you want to. There's card if you want to make a placard. There's all kinds of fabrics and stuff. You can cut them up, tear them up, make stuff, color in some lettering, do whatever you feel like. Just to note that there is acrylic paint in some of those pens, so please don't get it on yourself or on your clothes. But yeah, otherwise it's over to you. Does anyone have any questions? Just mind blown. Okay, so yeah, feel free to stand up, move around, get what you want, and yeah, off you go.